Well, thank you very much for joining this webinar, which is organised by ICUNet as part of the Oceans and Emma organisations. I think it's the International Careers Week. So I'm very pleased to be able to join in this conversation about careers, which is something that is very relevant to all of us in these networks as we transition from higher education into the world of work. My name is Rachel McCarthy, and I'm a member of the Oceans Network, and I joined the Oceans Network when it first started, actually, and I was the Australian coordinator in 2010. So I've had a long involvement in the Oceans Network, and I'm very grateful for my experiences, and I feel very privileged for being involved in this great network. I thought what I could do today is provide some information on working in international development, which is something that I've been doing for the last few years, a field that I've been working in for the last few years, and then hopefully also leave some time for questions. So I understand this session is supposed to last for 45 minutes. I'll try and speak for maybe 30 minutes of that, and then hopefully we can have some time for questions as well. Then it's evening here, so if anyone wants to keep discussing, I can be free for another 15 minutes. And I can also be in touch by email, and I'm very happy to exchange my contact details with you as well. So having said that, I think we've got this discussion space here. So if you do have questions as we're going through, please don't hesitate to enter them in. And I can try and respond to those questions. Or if I mention something and if you think you know better, or you have an example or something useful that you think could be of benefit to the group, then please don't hesitate to share that in the space as we go along as well. So I wanted to first of all focus on the concept of international development before looking into some specific advice on how you can get into the sector, some specific tips on how you can do that. And I wanted to share some key lessons from my experience working in international development. I've moved to Thailand in 2009 to do some volunteer work initially. I was working for the Australian government's AAD program, the Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development program, helping to set up a research centre at a local university. I enjoyed this experience immensely, and I ended up staying in Thailand for 4 years working in international development, predominantly, initially within Thailand, focused on capacity development in Thailand, particularly in the tertiary sector, and then broadening out to work in international development. And my area of focus has been education development, and I've been working with UNESCO for the last 2 years. And UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation. And more recently, I've been working for UNESCO as an external consultant from Australia. So the concept of international development, I think it's important to point out that it's actually something that's relatively new. When we think about international development, I don't think we often think of it in that way. I think we tend to presume it's something that's always existed, but it really hasn't. It's only really something that's existed since the end of the Second World War. And it's something that very much encompasses improving the quality of human life in a range of different areas, predominantly through foreign aid, also technical assistance and humanitarian aid. But foreign aid, so in areas of governance, healthcare, education, poverty reduction, human rights, gender equality, so basic social protection in these areas. And the reason, I guess, we've moved toward investing in international development in these areas has really been brought on by the close of the Second World War, when there was a real move towards reconstructing the world, when there was a real concern about least developed countries moving towards communism, especially from the American side. And as we moved away from colonialism or colonization toward a broader concept of globalization. So these driving forces were generating a greater focus on international development and the recognition that we really had a vested interest in this area of international development. Now, this, of course, led to the proliferation of international development theories over the last 50 to 60 years. International development organisations and agencies, and definitely evolving approaches And I think right now in history we're seeing a really interesting time of evolution in our understanding of international development as new players come into the scene and as the private sector starts to drive a lot of international development. So that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I really do think it's important to keep that in mind, that international development is a field that's not that old. It's relatively new. When I talk about international development, I'm thinking about agencies or organisations across three levels predominantly. So the national level, when we think about aid agencies like GIZ for Germany, JICA for Japan, DFID for the UK, so the aid arm of national governments. Multilateral organisations, of course, refers to UN agencies. And I think there are 27 different UN agencies working in different areas of development. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So those organisations that are really funded by countries, a number of different countries and organisations. Then, of course, there are non-governmental organisations, both nationally and internationally. We're looking at things like Oxfam, World Vision, Save the Children, Amnesty International. So that's my understanding of what international development agencies are. But of course, there are a number of different players in international development, and the private sector, of course, is predominant amongst them. Now, the reason I think international development is so interesting is because if you think about it, it really has only existed for a very short period of time, but we've made huge development strides in that period of time. And I think it's very easy for us to sit back and be very critical about the state of the world today. And I think it's easy for us to look at what's happening in Syria and what's happening in many parts of the world and think it's terrible that we live in a world with such incredible poverty. Why isn't something being done about that? And it is very distressing. And we look at the figures, for example, 57 million children out of school, still out of school in 2014, is really disheartening in many ways. But this is another way of looking at it. International development only began after the Second World War. In 1948, we established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From there, we established a number of international conventions to which a number of different countries, most countries, have ratified, at least the most significant ones amongst them. And in that time, as we've worked together more closely, enormous strides have been made. And this is one example from my area or my field, which is education. Now, if we look at illiteracy rates in the world today, compare that 1950 to the year 2000, we can see how much we've improved. It's dramatic. In the year 1950, less than half the world's adult population could read. That's not that long ago. So it's amazing to think of how much actually we've improved in a number of different ways, but we often don't look at it that way. And we look at what's happening today and become disheartened. But I think this is really encouraging and inspiring even to look at, because if you think about it, this was the year 2000. Things have progressed dramatically even since then, and things will continue to improve exponentially as our ability to connect increases, as information communication technologies increase, and as we discover new ways of approaching international development. So I think it's a really interesting field to be working in, and I think it's and a really exciting time to be working in international development right now, especially right now, because we're in the year 2014. Next year, 2015, is the deadline for the Millennium Development Goals, and also the Global Education for All Goals, which is something that I've been focused on in the area of education with UNESCO. That's the deadline of our global commitment to achieving fundamental development objectives. Next year we set new ones, and we have a whole new different way of approaching those. So yeah, it is really an interesting time to be working in international development. Having said that, it's very difficult, I think, if you want to get into the sector, to know where to start or what to do. And I think I have developed some strong opinions about how you can go about that and what you can do. Having worked at UNESCO for a few years and seeing what sorts of patterns young people go through in order to get into the organisation. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of people approach working in international organisations, especially multilateral organisations, such as the UN, through internships, which are usually not paid and don't necessarily lead to employment. In fact, usually they don't. And I see that pattern happen over and over again, and I wonder if that's really a good investment of money and resources. I also have an ethical issue with unpaid internships because I think that my own opinion is that we're learning throughout life. You know, we never stop learning. We're learning from the day we're born, we're learning until the day we die. You can be a CEO of 60 years with 40 years professional experience, or you can be an intern on the first day of a job. You're both learning. And I don't think that one person should be paid and one person shouldn't be, because you're both contributing knowledge and we shouldn't be investing in both of you. So I think that the practice of unpaid internships needs to change. And I would probably discourage people from pursuing unpaid internships unless it's something that is compulsory as part of your university degree. I would avoid it as a step into employment. Instead, I think I'd look toward volunteering opportunities, and there are a great number of volunteering opportunities out there. One organisation that I think is worth looking into if you are interested in getting international development is VSO, which is a UK-based organisation. I think they're good because they actually provide a stipend, so you can actually volunteer, go abroad and work in a country and still have some money, be given some support to do the work that you're doing. And they also have a very good international reputation. So if you work for VSO, for example, it's much easier, in my opinion, to work your way into a position with another organisation because it's well recognised. I think there is a tendency to look upon internships as a period of your learning, and you're not quite qualified yet to really step into the real world of work, which is not fair. But I think that's the reality, whereas professional volunteering opportunities don't necessarily come with that baggage. I was lucky because I was able to join one of these volunteering programs. So I've never done an internship myself. I just jumped straight into work. And my position was working as an Australian Youth Ambassador for Development. And this is a program that's funded by the Australian government. And was a fantastic foot in the door for me. So if you can look into opportunities to do volunteering, I would really recommend that. Perhaps your government runs a similar program. If anyone knows of organisations that they think others might be interested in, please, by all means, do share them in the chat as we go along. But another way, I guess, to approach volunteering is just simply through holidaying. You know, I think often we go abroad, especially members of the Oceans and Emma networks, given our great interest in international relations and travel. But that's also an opportunity for us to be learning. And I think that it's good for the soul to do volunteer work while you're abroad. So you can have a holiday, but you can also look into opportunities to actually work within a community, within an organisation, within an NGO, in a local community while you're on holiday. And don't forget that also is a great feather in the cap that you can put onto your CV afterward. So go for volunteering because it does lead, I think, to potentially better opportunities. It's not unequivocally true, but that's my opinion about it. Another thing I think is important to say is don't wait for opportunities to come to you. I think that if you're interested in something, then just start doing it. And one way to do that is just to start getting published. So if you're interested in an area, start reading about it and then start writing about it. And it's really easy to do that, especially now that we have the internet, which is a wonderful gift. I posted an article recently on Medium, which is, if you don't know Medium, an excellent platform for sharing stories. Somebody there picked it up and asked if I wanted to publish it on the Huffington Post blog, and I said sure. But I didn't even know that you could do that before then. And now this article is actually wonderful. It's getting lots of hits, and it's helping draw interest in a film that I'm involved in, which is fantastic. But it's also inspired me to realize that actually I should be doing a lot more of that, and I really should be writing a lot more. And in fact, I think we all can do that. If you have a passion in an area, start writing, and of course you can establish your own blog. I think that shows initiative, and I think that it's important in a world where we don't actually need to be sucking up to people anymore. You know, it's important for us to be demonstrating our own capacity and our own skills, especially because in a lot of development organisations, you're often asked to list the publications that you've written. And if you haven't worked in the field before, then how can anyone expect you to have a list of publications, aside from perhaps a university thesis or a few assignments here and there? So if you've been published in international media, that's an excellent source that you can link to. That's a publication in many ways. So start writing and start sharing that information. It could also be very useful for your CV. I think in a similar vein, you can also start thinking about starting your own project. So if you've been volunteering, for example, that might inspire you to look into opportunities to start your own project. And one thing that's interesting to think about is not just what you can do for a particular community while you're there, but what you can actually do when you get back home, because often they're very different. Now, you could start up all sorts of initiatives, and I have a friend who recently, who had been visiting India, working with a small community group, went back home and decided he wanted to keep in touch with them. And so he started up his own project, fixing mobile phones. So people's old, used mobile phones, often broken, and also laptops, and then shipping them to this community group, or organising for funding so that he can ship these pieces of equipment to this community group. So it's, I think, another important thing is to think about what we can do ourselves. And of course, that is also important on a CV to demonstrate that you have initiative and entrepreneurial spirit as well. I think there are a few really good websites to look at. I think the best one is devex.com jobs. So devex, UN jobs, of course. But bear in mind that when you're looking for jobs, often on these broad international websites, they don't list specific country-specific jobs. So jobs that might be specific to a particular duty station. I noticed that sometimes jobs that are posted for Thailand, which is where I've been based, aren't posted on broader international websites. They're posted on specific UN agency websites on their employment opportunities page, and they don't necessarily grab a lot of traction. So if you are interested in a particular country, look on the broader international websites for sure, but also look into agencies within those countries and look into what exists there, because that's often not captured in this in this broader way. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is also how to write a really good cover letter and CV. When I was at UNESCO as a staff member, it was very apparent to me that we all have very, very different styles when it comes to writing cover letters and CVs, and that's fine. But one thing I really appreciated was this particular style. This is actually shared from a friend of mine who works for International Organization for Migration in Bangkok. I find this really attractive for a number of reasons. I think if you state your name at the top left corner, have a nice blue column or a coloured column at the top, and also have that, I'll just skip to the next slide quickly, for your CV, it helps to stand out. It's very simple and it really helps you to stand out. Then I think you can state very clearly, skip the whole to whom it may concern, go right into application, state the position description, or this position title rather, and then follow that format there. I think this is a really good cover letter. And I'm very happy for you to take that and run with it, because we're all in this together, so by all means. One thing I think that's worth pointing out here is that I think it's important when you're looking at a job that's listed online, for example, you'll see that they often have a position description and then requirements. One thing that might be helpful is to look at those requirements and see how your qualifications, your skills and your knowledge match those requirements, and then list them in bullet point in your cover letter. So it's usually somewhere between about 5 and 10 requirements for a position. List them, not the requirements themselves, but list how you match those qualifications, and not just in terms of I have excellent communication skills, because anyone can say that, but demonstrate why you have excellent communication skills. In fact, use that word demonstrate. Don't say I have excellent communication skills. Say demonstrated communication strengths, having done XYZ is a much more convincing way to demonstrate that you have a skill than simply saying that you have a skill. So I'll skip quickly onto a CV. I think use that same approach with having your name at the top left corner. Keep it fairly simple and to 3 pages if you can. I think 3 pages is good. But I think one thing we often overlook is that we keep our same CV and we just recycle it and send it off to different employers. But it is actually also important to go through your CV and make sure that the terminologies you use in your CV match the terminologies used in the position description or the advertisement. I think that's really important to do, because those are the keywords that they're looking for. So it's often simply a case of just changing a word here and there, and it can make a big difference. One of my major tasks at UNESCO Bangkok was interviewing candidates for positions, particularly for internships. And there were a number of key questions that we always asked. But these questions, I think, are really important for you, not just in terms of the fact that they're common questions for interviews, but because reflecting on these things before you sit for an interview can really help build your confidence. Whether or not you actually say them in the end, they're there in your mind and they're shaping the way that you think about the position and how confident you feel about it. So do reflect on these things. Have prepared a key statement on why you've applied for the position and why you think you are a strong candidate for the position. Psychologically, it's a very good thing to do. Reflect back onto what you've stated in your cover letter regarding why you think you're suitable for the position, and expand on those in your mind, or if you're like me, talk to yourself. Enjoy the opportunity of sitting down and talking to yourself about why you're a good candidate for a position, because those are often interview questions that we don't prepare. You know, it's a really, really good thing to have prepared clear examples of why you think you're suitable for a position, because that will really help you stand out. If you can demonstrate, as I mentioned before, not just that you're a very good public speaker or that you're a very good writer, but if you can demonstrate really clear examples, then no one can argue with you that you're an excellent candidate for the position. One key thing also is to research really relevant statistics or facts that are relevant to the position. So one key fact I always think of is the fact that there are 57 million kids out of school today. And in the education world, reading through the Global Education Monitoring Report provides really useful statistics on the state of education today, if this is also your field. But whatever your field, do some key research and memorize just a few key facts. Not only does it demonstrate that you're really well prepared for the interview, that you've done your research, but it also demonstrates a real interest in the area that you want to work in. And then, of course, and I'm sure you do, prepare your questions for the panel as well. So invariably, they'll ask you, do you have any questions for us? Make sure you do have some, and don't feel like you've been caught off guard. Make it look as though you've really thought about this position carefully and you're really ready for this string of questions that you're about to unleash on them. I think those questions are particular to the position, so I can't really give you some examples. Suffice it to say that one question that might be useful is, can you provide me with an indication of what my day-to-day work in this office will be like? I think that can be useful for you as a springboard into then exploring other aspects of the work that they've outlined and what that could involve and what that might mean for your work there. And lastly, I wanted to reflect on just a few key lessons from my experience working in international development. And as I mentioned, I've really only had 4 years abroad in Thailand, and I am certainly still learning, and I've only got experience in education development. So this isn't to say that these lessons are true and it's unequivocally across the board, it's an unequivocal truth, but it's certainly something that I feel reflects my experience working in development. And I want to be honest about that. So I think the first thing I think of is that it's a highly bureaucratic environment, or it can be highly bureaucratic, working for a multilateral organisation or an NGO, or national governments, aid agencies. Highly bureaucratic. And I think this can be disheartening if you're not prepared for it, because at least for me, I thought brilliant ideas, creative ideas about what we could do to strengthen development gains in the Asia Pacific region, but they couldn't be implemented for various reasons. There's all sorts of red tape, which makes it very, very hard to move forward. That can be very frustrating, and I think it's important to be realistic about that. Of course, that might not be the case. If you work in international development, you might have had a completely different experience. Perhaps you've been working on the ground much more closely to the action than I have. Or perhaps you have a wonderful, wonderful team, and that's fantastic. But I think, taking a broad perspective, it is generally true that international development organisations are highly bureaucratic. And one thing that I've also found slightly frustrating is that the individuals that I think make the biggest difference in these organisations and in international development generally are often the ones that are least recognised for the work that they do. And I think that's almost a law of nature, because those that make the biggest difference aren't looking for recognition for what they do. And I'm certainly not talking about myself, but I've noticed this time and time again, that those that are genuinely committed don't seek recognition, and they don't get it either. So be prepared for that if this is something that you really are passionate about. If you're wanting to make a difference, then focus on that. Another interesting point, and very important point, is that global development landscape is shifting dramatically toward the greater involvement of the private sector and toward philanthropy. And one interesting example is I was recently, last year I was in America, and I met with a group of students who were part of a team that were building drones. And these drones were solar powered. So they had actually developed the technology to keep these drones, or these aircrafts, up in the air for about 5 days before they needed to come down. And they're very small. They could only, I think, carry about 150 kilos. And so they're very small flying objects. But it was very exciting to see this technology. Just recently, when I was listening to the radio, I heard that Facebook has actually bought out this private company, Titan, and their drones. And Mark Zuckerberg, through his organisation Internet.org, is hoping to use this technology to bring internet into communities that haven't had access to the internet before. And it's interesting because at the moment in the world, only about just over a third of the world's population has access to the internet. And his objective is to make sure that just about everyone has access to the internet within about 10 years. And that's something that I don't think traditionally international organisations would have had a chance of achieving. But that's something that's happening dramatically quickly, really, really quickly. And that's simply because of the greater involvement of the private sector and philanthropists. And that's a really interesting development, and might also be worth considering when you think about your role in international development and what sort of a capacity you would like to have, what sort of a role you would like to play. Simultaneous to that, of course, is a shift away from the traditional aid donor recipient model of international aid, where we've had rich countries giving money to poor countries. What we're seeing now, especially after 2008's financial crisis, is a shift towards new sorts of development models, which usually involves knowledge sharing, the leveraging of local traditions, of cultures, what they call South-South cooperation, so having less developed countries working with each other in knowledge sharing, rather than a kind of paternalistic approach to international aid, where rich countries are giving money to poor countries, and even triangular cooperation, which involves an industrialized country working with two less developed countries. So there is this really interesting change in how we look at international aid, and certainly international aid, official development assistance, has decreased quite dramatically since 2008, especially in the area of education. And the OECD countries who provide this aid are really struggling to meet their ODA requirements. Basically, they never are. And so that's really pushing us, especially middle income countries, especially the BRICS, to look at how we can actually improve that development landscape. And of course, this then paves the way for new understandings of international development. And I think that brings us back to the beginning of the presentation, when we talked about the fact that international development is something that is constantly evolving. It's something that's is relatively new, and our understanding of it is changing. And that understanding is changing quite rapidly right now, especially on the eve of 2015, the deadline for our development objectives set by the global. That's a good question. I guess it depends. Thank you, Ansgar. I think it depends. Your professional background, how relevant is that to your work in international development? My background was in acting and performance studies. I have an undergraduate degree in acting and performance studies. I then went and did a master's in international relations, and I have a master's degree in public relations, professional communication, and journalism. Not because I Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I don't know why that cut out then, but I'm back. Um, I was just mentioning that I had no idea that I wanted to work in education, and I was lecturing at a university, and that's when I realized that education is really interesting and something that I want to do more of. I could see just how much disparity in opportunity, in access to education, affected people's opportunities in life more broadly. And I have a strong opinion that education really is critical foundation to a better life. So that experience itself was what pushed me to work in education. Um, and I don't have a qualification in education at all. So um, in my experience, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that you have a qualification relevant to the work that you do, although I'm sure it probably helps. Sure, very happy to. I'll put my email address just down here, so you're all welcome to contact me if you would like to. Um, one thing I was going to say is that if you have specific questions that you would prefer to ask me privately and not in a group forum, then very happy to answer those questions as well privately. So just shoot me an email, and I hope that I can be helpful. Um, I wonder if there are any other questions that anyone wants answered here, though. Thank you. Okay, I'll go with those questions in order first. So if I don't fulfill all requirements of a job offering, um, um, I guess that's up to the individual, but in my opinion, um, I think that's subjective. I don't think that it's unequivocally the case that you don't fill the requirements of a job offering, and it might be the case that you can point to unusual or unlikely experiences to demonstrate that you do have the skills required for a particular position. So don't ordinarily assume that you don't have the qualifications. Look a little bit deeper and see if there is something that you can point toward. Even if it's weak, it's often a case of wording it effectively to strengthen your application. Having said that, if you genuinely don't have the relevant experience or you don't fulfill all the requirements for a position, it might also be the case that you're not quite ready for that position. And it might be the case that it's better for you to pursue something, whether it's volunteering or whether it's a different level, an entry-level position or something else that actually more accurately reflects your capabilities. But do have a think first before you jump to that conclusion and see if there is something that you can tweak in your experience. Because one thing I've definitely noticed is that often positions ask for a number of years of experience, but that's often it's often the case that they don't actually require you to have all of those years experience, and it might be the case that they don't have a great number of applicants for a position. So why not give it a try? That's my opinion about whether or not you should apply for a position, even if you don't fulfill the requirements. Um, is it possible one should add an abstract about the webinar so that people know about the contents? Okay, sure. I think there was an abstract, but if not, I'm sorry that it hasn't appeared somewhere. I think it should have appeared somewhere. At least it did on my screen. Maybe it could have been a more helpful explanation or expanded version. But in any case, I'm very happy for you to keep this presentation so you have all the contents for the webinar. Thank you, Lisa. You were working as a consultant expert researcher for the IOM, UNDP and UN Coordination Office, but not actually as an employee. Reflect on possible differences. That's interesting. You probably have a lot more experience than me, and perhaps you should be the one giving the presentation. And I do think that 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 I think organisations can be very different, and your experiences in these organisations must surely have been very different from mine. You know, I've been working in education development, but I've also had the benefit of working for the United Nations joint team on social protection, so working across a few different agencies, including UNICEF, the ILO, and UNDP, and also working for United Nations Development Group for the Asia Pacific region through their peer support group, which is basically a network of agencies, UN agencies, that look at how they can improve delivering one UN, so how they can improve coordination of different UN agencies across a region, making sure they're not overlapping. So I did get some insight into how different UN agencies are working, which was really interesting, and certainly experiences are very different. One thing that I think is important to point out is that there are very different levels within the UN system, and I think this is consistent across all agencies. You have consultancies, and then you have the permanent level staff, and there are huge differences in terms of opportunities, in terms of benefits, and I find that actually could be quite unfair. I've worked as both, as a staff member of UNESCO and now more consultant, and the benefits just disappear when you're a consultant. That's difficult. So there are huge differences in depending on what level you're at, whether you're permanent staff or not. So that's certainly very true that there are a number of differences, but in regards to specific differences across agencies, I'm afraid that I don't have a lot of experience working in these different roles as you have. So you might have more experience in regards to how these different organisations function, which are more effective than others, which work better. I'm not sure, but that would be really interesting to hear from you. And I really wish actually we could open this up so that we could have a conversation, because I'm sure we could certainly benefit from your experience. Georgia, I don't have any experience regarding online volunteering. No, I don't have any experience in this area at all, actually. When I was at UNESCO Bangkok, one thing we did do was allow volunteers to work for us externally. So they were actually interns, and they were based in different countries, and we would send them out work assignments, and they would work on these assignments for us and send them back to us on the proviso that we would be able to give them some sort of recognition for the contribution that they were making to our work. So a kind of statement of having completed an internship with us. This was something that I was really pushing for in the organisation, because I think it's really important when you're working in international development, and especially in education development, to be providing opportunities for people that don't have the funds to be able to come and work in an office in a different country. So I thought online volunteering is an excellent idea, but it's not something that's been very well supported in the organisations that I've worked with. For a number of different reasons, I think that they've found that they can't be sure that the person contributing is actually the person contributing. And they want to make sure that they can really monitor somebody's experience and make sure it's a quality experience. So that's my only experience with online volunteering, if that's what you mean, but perhaps you have a more experience or a different understanding of what that can involve. And if so, I'd be happy to talk about that more with you. Maybe I can learn from you. How one can incorporate input in an international organisation. Do you mean, and just correct me if I'm wrong, do you mean how you can contribute most effectively as an individual within an organisation? I think it depends on the sort of role that you have. One of my frustrations at UNESCO was that I was employed at a very low level, and so I didn't have a lot of sway. My opinion didn't really count for much, and I was pushing papers, and I was yes sir. So that was one of my frustrations, because I felt that I had a lot more to contribute, but in reality it wasn't my place to do that. And in a tight bureaucracy, I think that that you have to make sure that you are contributing what is expected of you, and not overstepping the mark. I think, having said that, it's important to contribute the best of yourself, and it is important. One thing I've learned is to deliver what is expected of you, and then just 10% more, because I think that always is appreciated and always reflects well on you. But having said that, one of the challenges that I had working with the UN is that I had a tendency to probably overstep the mark and want to contribute more than I was being asked to do. In a negative way, I wanted to contribute more than what I was being asked to do. I wanted to push boundaries and really challenge authority, but that didn't necessarily always work well for me. Okay. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down. Yes, I would also be very interested, as Anska mentioned, Sladyana, if I pronounce your name correctly, in learning about your experience as well, and perhaps we can connect. I suppose we can find a way to exchange emails for anyone that's interested, and I'll speak with Ralph and see how we can do that. How about in a moment, when I've answered these questions, anyone that wants to can add their email at the bottom, and we can keep in contact that way, and I'll speak with Ralph and we can find a way to organise that. But I'll just answer these questions first. Thank you, Sladyana. Sure, the projects that I worked on were usually involved technical vocational education and training, quality education. So looking specifically now at, we've reached a point in terms of education development where just about all kids are in school these days in most countries. I mentioned a figure of 57 million, and that's true. But if you look at it more broadly, just about all kids are in school these days, except for in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, mostly. So the focus now is shifting more towards how do we not just get kids in school, but how do we actually improve the quality of the education that we're providing? And what does that mean in terms of what a curriculum should actually involve? And so for me, that's involved looking into new areas of focus in curriculum. So how we encourage or how we incorporate socio-emotional intelligence in curriculum, how do we develop that in children is a really emerging area when we look at improving the quality of education. And that's something that's been a real focus of my work, is socio-emotional intelligence. So moving away from just presuming that math, science and languages are the only things that matter, but looking at the arts, looking at languages, a variety of different languages, looking at drama, looking at a variety of different fields, and seeing how that can be better incorporated in a school curriculum. Because often, especially in countries of the Asia Pacific where I've been focused, it hasn't been the case. One of my major works actually involved working with the government of Malaysia in reviewing their national education system as part of their establishment of a blueprint for education development for the next 10 to 15 years, which was very interesting. So a lot of my own focus has been based on Malaysia. So as I mentioned, technical vocational education and training, quality education, looking particularly at assessment in the context of quality education. And also education post 2015. So what happens now when we reach 2015? What should the international community be doing to help improve education beyond that? What sorts of goals should we be rallying behind? Leading up to 2015, we've been focused on a set of 6 education-specific goals, which have been achieved to varying degrees across countries. But how do we improve upon that next year for the next 10 to 20 years? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ralph. That's probably a better approach. So anyone that's interested in more information can send an email to that email address just there. And Ralph will share that with me, or you can, of course, write directly to me. That sounds good. Thank you very much, Ralph. I wonder if anyone else has any more questions about anything to do with the presentation that we can talk about here. Thank you, Ansgar. Okay, I think then we can call that a wrap. Thank you very much for joining in, and I really appreciate your attention, and I hope that this has been interesting and valuable, useful to you. And as mentioned, Ralph will happily collect any emails, so send your email address to him if you want to be a part of a broader discussion on this, or do contact me directly if I can provide you with any specific information or advice, or if there's something that I can learn from you, or if you have any corrections you'd like to make to this presentation, I'd be very happy to learn. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you.